I'm going to start this interview about pastor friend's switch to the Christian Standard Bible with a little story of how I met him. His name is Dustin Battles, and he's a pastor in the Cincinnati area at Mercy Baptist Church. He's got a beautiful website, if I do say so myself. I helped make it. His brother, who's also a friend of mine, made the excellent logo for that one. Dustin and I have been friends since time immemorial. He was an undergrad student at Bob Jones when I was a grad student, and he really sought me out as someone to be a mentor, an older seminary student. He was studying to serve the church, and we just have become lifelong friends. We talk every month, and there aren't that many people that I have scheduled talks with every month. I really appreciate his godly friendship. We are friends who are able to keep each other accountable for sin and for treating our wives well, all that good stuff. And something I've always loved about Dustin is his ability with church music. He is a writer who has written several texts that have actually been set to music and published by significant church music publishers out there, and he's a great singer. Although the one time we tried to sing together, I'm sure you remember this, Dustin, it did not go well because I wanted to do barbershop and you wanted to do your classical bel canto, which I also appreciate, and you have a beautiful tenor voice. Anyway, I'm not letting you talk. Can you tell us how you serve the body of Christ before we get into this conversation about why you switched to the Christian Standard Bible?
Sure. So I am the pastor of Mercy Baptist Church in Westchester, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cincinnati in the southwestern part of Ohio. And I've been there since 2015, so that's my main full-time role. And then I also, for fun, in my spare time, write hymns and psalms and other songs and lyrics, and as you mentioned, published with different publishers. My wife and I enjoy performing music together. We obviously serve on a really local basis here at our own church, but then occasionally we get opportunities to serve with music elsewhere, which is always fun to perform and to minister with my dear wife.
Yeah. Tell me the name of the choir again that you're in or have been in the past in your area.
Yeah, I was in the Cincinnati Vocal Arts Ensemble, which is a professional choir that is based out of Cincinnati, is part of, has performed different Grammy-winning performances. I was in it for several years before they reorganized about a year ago. A wonderful trek that I had with them.
Yeah. Now, none of that is relevant, the choir stuff, to why you switched to the Christian Standard Bible, but I just think it's very interesting, and I've always been a little bit jealous of you, Dustin. I'll just be honest about this, that you have such a beautiful voice, because I love choral music too, and I can do it, but I could never make it quite to the level that you did. So, props to you. Now, let's switch right to talking about the Christian Standard Bible, because you're now using it. Do you have your physical copy that you preach from within
that's
distance?
Complex.
Okay.
I actually have switched recently to preaching out of these little scripture notebooks.
Oh, wow. Look at you.
If you want a mess of an example here, I use handwritten notes.
Oh, nice.
And they're color-coded, and it keeps me from having to rewrite it every single week, or then I write down my notes and then I transfer it to some other device. But then I also have on the pulpit with me this one here, which is the handcrafted single column, double column verse by verse format. And sometimes I will preach. That one. Sometimes I will preach from the actual Bible, but the wide margins do help.
I sure hope someone doesn't take that out of context. Sometimes I will preach from the actual Bible. That's not what you mean.
No. The big old leather-bound, huge copy is what I meant, yeah.
I won't say who this was, but a friend of mine, shall we say, was just arguing with her mother-in-law, who was obviously older, and her mother-in-law was very skeptical about reading your Bible on a phone. Like, that's not okay. Like, that's actually sinful. So I'm not sure what she would think about a scripture journal. We'll see. But you have been there as long as I've been at Faith Life, so it just seems hard to believe it's been 7 years for you, because we've been talking about your pastoral ministry that whole time. You've been faithful. And I remember when this first came up, I was kind of surprised that you would want to move away from the ESV or NIV. What were you on now? I can't remember.
I was on the NIV 2011.
Because
yes.
that's what you inherited from the previous...
Sort of, yes.
Okay, longer story. You know what?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit of that longer
Okay,
story.
sure.
How did you get on the NIV?
Yeah, so when I came, there were 3 elders, pastors who served before me in various capacities from part-time to full-time or lay positions. One of them used the NIV in 1984. He was the founding pastor. His kind of co-pastor was a big fan of the New King James because he was actually one of the translators on the New King James Version back in the 80s, which I think is kind of cool.
Give us his
And
name
then
real
another
quick.
of the elders. Sorry?
Give us his name real quick, the one who was working on the New King
Newton
James.
Bush, Dr. Newton Bush.
Okay, I just think it's really helpful to personalize these people.
Yeah.
You know, in the King James only debate, they just seem like these ivory tower people, and you don't think this guy who did that book or those books, and you sent me an email that showed some of the stuff that he'd done for the New King James.
Yeah.
He was just a pastor of a not mega church and just trying to be
Oh,
faithful,
yeah.
serving the Lord.
Exactly. He has a THD, I think, from Dallas Theological Seminary, if I remember correctly. And then the third elder, who served for a number of years, used the New American Standard. So I inherited a healthy plurality of versions at the church. But when I came, it was almost 5 years after the NIV 84 had stopped being published. So I was faced with a decision. Do I use a translation that's no longer used, the NIV 84? Do I use the New King James, which I wasn't a huge fan of, but I could have tolerated? Or do I use the New American Standard, which I really had very little familiarity with, other than the fact that it had a good reputation? And so I thought, well, I already like the NIV as it is, so why don't I just use the NIV 2011, and that's not going to be too much different than the 1984. And sure enough, I got one question and one question only for the first 5 years of my ministry here. And it came when I was candidating at the church, and it was, do you plan on using the NIV as your preaching translation? And I said, yes. That was it. And so for 5 years, it went very, very smoothly. And so I actually have done 2 different Bible translation switches. One is when I first came right out of the chute, and then the next was when I switched last year to the CSB.
And I've heard sermons from you, and we talk about your sermons. You are an expository preacher. You're preaching the text.
Oh, yeah.
And I have found that, people in our conservative world are skeptical that anybody who preaches from the NIV could or would, preach expository messages, but you definitely do. Okay, so you were moving along with the NIV, and to a lot of people in our world, I think they would have some familiarity with the NIV, and I think a general negative feeling, though not a terribly negative one. Of course, in the King James only world, they would have a very negative feeling. Peter Ruckman called it the nutty idiots version. Rather clever of him, and but I don't think most people go that far.
Inspired version.
Yes, I've heard that one too. And did your pastor test positive for NIV? I've heard that one too. Yeah, that's just horrendous. So, why did you? What made you want to switch to the CSB?
Well, I actually switched accidentally. So, a long story made short, there was, in my 6th year of ministry, a dust-up, you might say, or I guess it was toward the end of my 5th year. And there was a family in particular that realized that I wasn't using the 1984 NIV, but was using the 2011 NIV, and got not upset, but dissatisfied.
And the complaint was that, well, basically, to boil it down, the NIV 2011 supposedly is gender inclusive and therefore is a threat to complementarianism, though you are complementarian and had never questioned that publicly, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the NIV kind of took one for the team when it came to inclusivity in 2011, and really going back before that with the TNIV and the NIVI in the 1990s. And so when the 2011 came out, it was, some people were a little bit shocked and even gobsmacked that they would include it in the NIV translation itself and not call it something different. And then to make matters worse, they just stopped printing the 1984 entirely, and it's only available in very few places on the internet, even to this day. So all that to be said, I had a little bit of controversy to deal with in the church, a dust-up, if you will, and I realized maybe it would be helpful to teach a Sunday school series on Bible translations and why we can trust our English Bible translations. Just trying to bolster the confidence that our congregation already had.
That sounds really good, Dustin.
Yeah, I just took it as an opportunity to
That's great.
pastor the congregation that God had given me to do. So it wasn't a defense of my particular translation. It wasn't an attempt to try to transition the congregation to another translation. It was just an attempt to try to shepherd the congregation in an issue that we all have to deal with, reading our English Bibles.
Okay, so then how did you end up shifting to the CSB? If that wasn't your purpose in doing this series, I suppose you didn't quite answer then why yet. Let's make sure we get to the why, and then we'll get to the how.
Yeah, sure. So I put it into three different ways of putting it. I have the elevator speech where you got like 10 seconds, 20 seconds to describe why I switched. Then there's the little bit longer explanation, and then I have the full reason. So the short reason is that it's a modern language translation with the high level of accuracy, and it has a good reputation. If I'm in the elevator, I'd be glad to tell somebody that short little spiel.
That's great.
If somebody says, "What do you mean by that?" then I say, well, I switched from my previous translation because it's just as accurate as the NIV, if not more so. It's just as vernacular, and it has a lot less baggage and stigma than the NIV, and a lot of our church members were already using it. So that's like, I have a really slow elevator or an elevator that has to go up like 80 stories. That's a little bit longer. And then the longest explanation I have, however many you want to hear. I have 10 of them. I'm not sure how many of you want to hear. But
let's say that we're in the Burj Khalifa and we're in the elevator. So a long elevator speech, which is kind of like medium
plenty
level.
of time then. Okay, medium level. Okay,
good.
Got it. So the first reason is it's accuracy. It's got to be the main reason for any good Bible translation. It has to be an accurate translation. And again, I know you've talked about this for years, is that evangelical translations are accurate, and that we have God to praise for. And even the NIV, which I used for the first 5 years at our church, I really benefited from. Even for the 5 years that I was there, occasionally I would come across something that I would go, I would prefer that it be this way, but I never try to knock a translation in my preaching and teaching because I want to have that confidence there in the English translations.
Amen. Excellent.
So I will say something like, it could also be translated this way, or another way to say that is, and that helps people to realize that whatever translation they have in their lap, ESV, NIV, NASB, even NLT, there's different angles and light that they bring to the same object. And the CSB is a very good translation. It does a good job at that. And even when I'm looking at BDAG, for instance, that standard lexicon that we who use the original Greek language.
This is the Greek
site.
English lexicon. If you want to look up what does a Greek word mean, this is the most authoritative and helpful source. Yeah.
Bauer, Denker, Arndt, Gingrich, something like that.
You got it.
And when I look it up in there, what I often see is something akin to the NIV or the CSB. So it was like an easy switch for me. But there was just a little bit more accuracy when it comes to the CSB. For instance, I was preaching through Mark within the last year and a half or so, and I noticed that the CSB said for the word gnaphus, they use the word in English launderer, a launderer, as bright as the launderer's garments. The ESV and the NIV simply say no one could bleach them that white, or anyone, that more so than anyone could bleach them. And I thought, well, that's kind of a
dynamic translation, a functional one.
Yeah. And so I thought that's a helpful translation to help people visualize what, in this case, Mark wrote when he wrote that. So that's just one example from the first one. Number two is vernacularity, which I know is kind of a fancy word, so you might call it intelligibility. And it's a modern translation, and it's suitable even for those who speak English as a second language. We don't have a lot of ESL people in our church, really any, but we have a lot of children, and they have to learn English. And even my own son, who we adopted from China, he had to learn English when we came here. And so it's an opportunity for us as a church to say the translation that's kind of our translation is going to be one that even the children can read and benefit from. I want them to have access to the Word of God in the vernacular. Yeah. As helpful as translations that are more traditional are, like the ESV, the New King James, of course the King James, even the New American Standard, 77 and 95, there are some archaisms that you don't realize are there until you read something like the CSB or the NIV or the NLT. And I thought, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to serve the younger people and those who are learning in our church by using a vernacular translation.
I have to stop you for a second here, Dustin, and praise you, because so we were shaped in an era, both of us, you and me, in which the ESV was the new prominent translation in our tribe. And the ESV came out my first year of seminary, 2001, which would have been right as you were coming to school or undergrad or right before, I can't remember.
I came to undergrad in 2004, so it had been out for a couple years.
Oh my goodness, been out for a couple of years. Okay, so I remember you having an ESV back in those days.
Yeah.
I certainly had more than one. And I just kind of always expected, without much thinking about it, that somebody like you would carry on with the ESV. But I remember you giving very early on, some point in grad school when you were in seminary, I think, this criticism, gentle, not nasty, of the ESV, saying, yeah, but sometimes it's more archaic than necessary. It's kind of holding on to some of the older King James ways of putting things. And I was so used to it being example? My tribal, please. I was so used to it being my tribal, favorite that I was surprised that you would do that. But I thought that's really helpful. We're trying to be objective here. Yeah, so go ahead and give an example.
Yeah, so here's Matthew 6:34. Therefore do not be, this is ESV, therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. That's pretty much standard across all the translations, but this part in particular is a little archaic or something. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Okay, I kind of get what you mean, but why not say like this, like the CSB does? Each day has enough trouble of its own. Now,
great.
It's, I'm not a Greek scholar, but to me, that is much more intelligible than it is sufficient is the day, for the day is its own trouble.
Right, which comes really from the King James tradition. And so it doesn't strike me as different from my English because I'm so used to it. All my work on the King James, it has actually forced me to go against the grain of my upbringing in that I really was used to the language. I've had to make myself stop and think many times, is this really the way we would say it? And that's what tradition does. It kind of puts you into a rut, and so it can be really helpful. And then frequently you will run across these things and you'll realize, wow, I guess I really didn't understand what it was saying. Okay, keep going. That was a great example.
Yeah, so other examples include Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2 in the King James, ESV, I think the New American Standard does it too. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Well, when modern English speakers and readers think of the word vanity, do they tend to think of the enigmatic, fleeting, futile aspect to life, like the teacher meant? Or do they tend to think of like vanity as in like someone who is vain, someone who thinks a lot about themselves?
Right.
And so the ESV and all those in its tradition say vanity. The NIV says meaningless, which I can see where they're coming from, but it's a little bit more negative, I think, than what the teacher actually meant. And then, but futility is actually a wonderful translation that we all get. Something is futile. It's really hard to get through. You're struggling with it. There's a frustration there, and I think that captures well. Or I think this is an example that you've used before, but I've noticed it as well. Matthew 6:28. Why do you worry about your clothes? Observe how the wildflowers of the field grow. They don't labor or spin. Well, spin what? I just think it was like rotating. Well, I'm like, what? Flowers spin?
That was really the way you took it?
Oh, yeah, for years.
Yeah, interesting.
And then I read
so I've
the
run into
CSB.
intelligent people like you, who missed that. And right, go ahead. Great example.
And then it says in the CSB, they don't labor or spin thread. Oh, that's what it means. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Or here's an
Isn't that a
example
great
I
mental
came
picture?
across.
Spinning flowers, yeah.
Exactly. Here's an example I came across in Amos 4:6. I was actually reading this near my wife one night, and I asked her what she thought it meant. I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities. That's ESV and NASB. By the way, there's no footnote in the ESB and the NASB as to what that could mean. It's just completely blank. I gave you cleanness of teeth. So I asked my wife, who is one of the most intelligent people I know, what do you think cleanness of teeth means? And she guessed something that was actually a really good guess. I don't remember what it was, but it was a good guess, but it was nonetheless incorrect. The NIV says, I gave you empty stomachs. So it uses an idiom in the place of an idiom, a modern idiom for an ancient idiom. And the CSB just says, I gave you absolutely nothing to eat in all your cities. Either of those are completely intelligible.
Yeah, and every one of those is accurate according to the philosophy that drives the translators. We're not saying the ESV was bad, or certainly that the King James was bad there. Okay?
Now, I
will say
that just a slight bit of criticism toward the ESV and the NASB. No one's going to understand what that means nowadays. Why not put a footnote that refers to the fact that there was not enough food? That would have been much more helpful.
I take that, and I would call that a slight criticism, because at this vantage point, I don't think it's clear to us whether cleanness of teeth was an idiom, therefore something that was commonly known among Amos's readers, or would they possibly have said the same thing we say today? Like, what? What does that mean? We can't know at this vantage point, so it's okay for some translators to go the more literal direction. It's understandable that ESV and NASB would go that direction. And it's okay for someone to say, well, I think it probably was an idiom. Why would he say something like that people aren't going to get? So we're going to choose an equivalent idiom in our day. And we have this embarrassment of riches, and we can check the CSB and NIV and expect a more functional, intelligible translation. We can read the NASB and ESV and see, okay, that was the thing that was literally going on here, off of which the NIV or CSB made some interpretation. Yeah, these are all great examples, and I think it's so helpful to get concrete, and for the point of all these stories to be, we just want to understand, right?
Exactly.
We're not saying this is accurate and that's a lie. We're saying it's all helpful for understanding, and the CSB kind of comes out on top for the purposes that you have and the audience that you have.
Yeah.
Okay, so where are
fair.
we in our list here?
That
what
was
floor are
number
we
2.
on if we go down the Burj Khalifa? Okay.
That was number 2. Number 3 is commonality. It was already a translation that many of our church people were voluntarily using and bringing to our church. Yeah, and I don't necessarily know why.
Radar?
I don't know. I mean, obviously it was republished in 2017, changing from the HCSB to the CSB. So maybe they saw ads, or some people went to T4G in 2018 or so and got a free copy, but I don't think any of our church people did that. And so for me, it was like a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. I already have people in our congregation who are using the CSB. Why not use what they're already using? And then just statistically, the CSB has risen to be one of the top 6 translations that are being purchased nowadays, according to the ECPA, Evangelical Christian Publishers Association. Yeah.
According
top
to
6
the
usually.
Statement of Faith, everything we do at Faith Life has to be, it has to fit that statement of faith, just for what it's worth.
Yeah. So that was number 3. Number 4, I call it acceptability. It's got a good reputation. Holman and the CSB have a good reputation. Granted, the HCSB wasn't super well known. Came out in New Testament form in 99, if I recall, and then in full form, including the Old Testament, in 2004. So we're not even 20 years out. But it does have a good reputation. I've talked to people. In fact, I talked to a pastor just last week, and we were talking about translations, and he asked what I use, and I said, I actually just switched to the CSB about a year ago, and he said, I've heard good things about that translation. So it has a good rap. It's also been wise in its translational decisions concerning things like inclusivity. It follows the Colorado Springs guidelines, which of course was the big heated subject back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And then just practically speaking, when it comes to the commonality, it reads like the ESV and the NIV, which are its two nearest friends on the spectrum of translations. Right. And so overall, it has a good reputation. Acceptability is what I call number 4.
That's great.
Number 5, supportability. I feel like I'm doing Dave Letterman's top 10 or something like that. Supportability. It's a translation I want to support by my use of it. Yeah. I think you know this from your research, and I came across it in my preparation as well, is that both the NIV and the ESV almost didn't make it out of the gates because of financial issues. It's hard to get a translation off the ground. So in getting behind an evangelical publisher like Holman, which incidentally is the oldest publisher of Bibles in North America, thought that was interesting. In getting behind that publisher, I'm saying I want this to continue for the years and decades to come.
Yeah, I like that one too. These are all good, Dustin. I like this. Keep going.
Number 6, immunity. And this is kind of an odd one. You'll have to bear with me.
Yeah.
I call it immunity because just like there are King James only people, there's actually ESV only people. And there's NASB only people. What D.A. Carson calls them is linguistic conservatives, those who think that they are going to conserve the linguistics of the actual Bible. I know it's a pun to call them ESV only and NASB only, but functionally speaking, it's very, very similar to that. When it comes to the CSB, people's impression is right in that it's both accurate and vernacular. So in a way, it's kind of like some sort of immunity, a shot against those who are intense and or scary and or divisive when it comes to Bible translations.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Actually, the video that I did about the CSB, that was pretty lengthy, actually. You know, the CSB is the best Bible translation. That was the title. It was part of my best Bible translation series. As you might recall, I also had one, the NIV is the best Bible translation, the ESV is the best, and even the King James is the best. You have to watch those if you haven't seen those, viewers out there. But that was the big point I made in the CSB video, that it pretty neatly holds that line on the graph that holds together readability and accuracy. That's the reputation that it's gotten. So I think you're right on that one.
And even some researcher did a scholarly
that was in my video.
assessment.
Yep.
Oh, that's right. That wasn't on there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Number 7, technicality. Foreign translations often give their rendering of the word or phrase, but when it's hard to understand, they don't give any help, or at least rarely give you help as to what the phrase might mean functionally, like cleanness of teeth in Amos 4. So you're reading, you don't know what a phrase means, it's using some ancient idiom, you have to pull out some other translation. On the other hand, translations on the functional side of the spectrum, they do sometimes, but they don't often tell you what the more formal rendering is in the footnotes. And it's like, well, I care about these things. I want to have both at my disposal. I want to be able to see a functional rendering and a formal rendering. And I think that the CSB does a good job balancing what the reader needs to know without becoming the Net Bible, which has 40,000 notes or whatever it is.
So that has its place. Like the Net Bible is the only study Bible I ever use. I'm not putting down any other study Bible, but it has a kind of information and a kind of quickness of getting to that information that nobody else has, especially with textual, critical, and translation notes. But that's not good for church. That's a personal study thing. So the CSB has, you're saying, I think, just enough information for any Bible reader, and also for church type uses in a study. You can appeal to the, literally the Greek has whatever. Yeah,
and you might disagree from time to time, like what should have been in the text versus in the footnote.
Right.
But the fact that it often does both is a good indicator. Like, for instance, I was reading last night in Jeremiah about King Coniah. Well, who's Coniah? I mean,
Jeconiah, there's a big discussion there over that.
Yeah, exactly. So it puts Coniah in the text, and then in a footnote, it says that this person is probably Jeconiah. So things like that I think are helpful, and it has a good balance of what to show the reader. like to use the math analogy, how much of your homework to show that you've been doing. It doesn't give you everything like the Net Bible, and yet it also doesn't give you too little like the ESV can tend to do.
Yeah. Okay, Dustin, these are all excellent. We promised each other that we would be a little more efficient. So even though
that's true.
the elevator's probably at floor 28 right now, the wire just snapped, and you're gonna have to shout the last three.
I'll give the next two, be real brief on the next two.
Great.
Number 8, availability. Got a number of different good options, ranging from like the cheap True Tone type things all the way up to the handcrafted that I just showed you earlier. Familiarity. You show up at a church with a New American Standard, and the church is using CSB. It's going to feel somewhat in the same ballpark to what you're used to. Now, number 10, if I can take a moment to explain.
Yes, now
what
we're
I mean
in the
by
lobby
this.
of the Burj Khalifa. And it's a large lobby. We can walk out to the door. You can explain on the way.
Perfect. So I call it tranquility, because there are two things that kind of bothered my conscience about it, because for a number of years, 5 years or more, I had used the ESV as my personal reading Bible, and yet I has also used it as my preaching translation. It was like this perfect world, like the King James was back in the day, where everyone spoke that language, everyone used the translation of that language. But I came to the realization, first of all, that my favorite translation, my reading translation, didn't necessarily have to be my preaching translation. So I can still use the NIV in my personal time, like I tend to do, but yet at church, preach and teach primarily from the CSB. And then the other thing that calmed my conscience was the fact that I don't have to just use one translation in my preaching and teaching. Now, yes, we did buy pew Bibles, and they're we have chairs, but they're underneath the chairs, and we had to pick one. We couldn't choose a multitude. But the CSB is just kind of my starting point, and I am welcome to use something different. For instance, when I preached from Genesis 3:15 about the bruising of the heel and the head and so forth, I preached basically my own translation of that text, because I didn't feel that any of the particular translations really hit all of my areas specifically. So I just kind of said what I tend to think. Or when I was finishing up the Psalms in my Wednesday night Bible study, I continued to use the NIV, because that's what I had been using for the while previous to that. So those are the 10 reasons that I switched from the NIV to the CSB.
Good work, Dustin. How'd you do it? How'd you practically go about making this switch?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of stumbled into this transition. It wasn't an intentional. The controversy came into the church. Maybe controversy is too strong of a word. The dust up that came into the church, and I thought, why don't I teach a series on Bible translations in Sunday school? And then by the end of that, I thought, I can do all of these things that I want to do, that I think a good translation has, and do it with a different translation that has a little less baggage and is even more accurate than before. So that the purpose of that series which was about 15 weeks, was to try to bolster that confidence in the English translations. And I started with the foundations and then moved to really specific things. So started off with things like, we actually have God's breathed out word. Okay, then how do we know what the original said? That's textual criticism. How we know that God has given us his written word. Okay, why then do we need translations? Well, none of us speak Hebrew and Greek. What makes a good translation? Why are there various approaches in the spectrum these days, ranging from the formal to the more functional? There's a question that comes up pretty frequently that I tried to address in there. To what extent do translations use interpretation as they translate? I took quite a bit of time on that, because I didn't think anybody else had really addressed that, so I wanted to solidify it in my own mind, and even for the objectors that sometimes people talk with, like, oh, well, I don't like the functional translations because they do too much interpretation. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then I wanted to give us the tools to understand the concept of interpretation, like semantic range and what the terms formal versus functional mean and how they operate in their particular guidelines. And then we talked about the differences between like textual variants and translational differences, because that's important. You think that one translation has just totally lost it. Oh, that's actually a textual variant. I see. So you can help sort through that. And then I addressed that sticky topic of what inclusivity is, how all translations use inclusivity, and the pros and cons of using inclusivity in a Bible translation. So that was a 15-week or so class on Sunday school. So that was the second way that I switched. The first was just accidentally, and then the second was slowly. I took my time. It took me weeks, months to go through it.
I was impressed with that. I really appreciated the stuff that you sent me and the conversations we were having. You were praying for wisdom, and I just felt like the Lord answered your question. And I think this interview demonstrates, I mean, your prayer request for wisdom. I think this interview demonstrates that, even if someone comes to a different conclusion for their circumstance. And that's one of my messages, right? The Bible doesn't tell us which Bible translation to use.
Sure.
And all your reasons make great sense to me.
Yeah. The third way that I switched was uncontroversially. What kind of drives me nuts about the modern landscape is that in choosing a translation for your church, at least the primary one, it's almost like you're declaring to everyone, hear ye, I think that this translation is the best one ever.
And that drove me
nuts. Yeah, right. And I don't want to put others down. It's not like my favorite football team where I have to trash talk the other teams. Like, I want to be supportive of all the translations. So in other words, we're not just a quote-unquote CSB church. I haven't declared it as my favorite translation ever. I don't even actually use it as my primary translation in my personal reading. Nevertheless, it is our Pew Bible, and it is kind of my starting point for translation usage in the pulpit. But when guest preachers come to preach or speak, I just ask them to use a translation they're comfortable with, a modern one preferably, and that has ended up practically ranging from the KJV, such as an elderly speaker I had one time who that's all that he's used, to the NIV, because that's what this particular missionary used. So it was kind of uncontroversial. That was the third way. It was, I intended it. I wanted it to be uncontroversial.
Right.
The fourth way is what I already mentioned earlier about just pastorally bringing them through that. Took my time.
Right.
But then also that pastoral trust was a huge factor when I came in 2015, and then I switched to the CSB in 2021. When I came in 2015, there was already a healthy plurality between the NIV 84, the New King James, and the New American Standard. So people were used to having different translations. And then when I shepherded them through this process, they thus were trusting me to do so in a wise way. And then similarly, I call this one culturally. Because we had these number of good translations, there was a healthy plurality already present. So that was, if you were keeping track, accidentally, slowly, uncontroversially, pastorally, and culturally.
I think you're a Baptist preacher, Dustin. You have good outlines. That was a 4-point outline, though, not a 3-point outline. So I don't know what kind of Baptist you are. So what reactions did you get from your teaching on the topic and from this switch?
Yeah, when you asked me that question in advance of this interview, I thought, you know what, I don't really know specifically. I only have kind of like a vague idea. So I sent a survey to our church people, and I did, what did I do, like 10 questions or so? And
I've got it up on the screen for everybody.
Yes, is it? You have it screen sharing?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me go to the transition itself, because that was your question, right? How did the transition go at the church? I didn't have a lot of responses, but I think this is pretty typical of the rest of the church. 60, basically 2/3 of people thought it went quite smoothly. 22% said it was quite smooth. No, that was 22% said it was uncontroversial. Great. No one said it took me a while to get used to, but the church seemed to handle it well. No one said it was awkward gave a negative or response. Poorly done. Yeah, exactly.
That's great.
So I thought that was kind of a helpful marker to know how the transition itself went. I also asked questions like, how helpful was the series just in general? And of the responses I got, almost everyone said that it was very helpful. Some thought
Right.
it was pretty helpful, and then one person was like, "Eh."
Was
So I
that
think
your
that's a
wife?
pretty good response. I
I'm
do
just
not know,
kidding.
and I'm not sure I want to know.
This is really great. And I think one of your points was like, okay, by not staking out the claim, this is the best, you don't force anybody who's kind of not really 1,000% excited about changing their Bible translation or you changing yours. You're not forcing them to, retrench and dig in their heels because you're not demanding, right, that anybody else even bring the translation that you preach or teach from. So it didn't have to be
Exactly.
controversial. Nobody has to
Yeah.
change what they personally, physically do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so it's kind of interesting to me that this poll, you put it out, you get very positive responses. That's really great. But without that poll, you wouldn't have even known because it just hardly created a ripple, it seems like, in your church.
Yeah, that's fair. It seemed to go well from my vague perception, but I thought, let's
Yeah.
just kind of see it in writing, and that's what's helpful. So that was the actual teaching. Now here's some of the responses from the switch itself. And okay, cool. That's no problem at all. I like that. 25% said finally. In other words, they've been waiting for me to do this. And then the third option, sure, why not, was 37.5. So in
Yeah.
other words, everyone was like ranging from, okay, sounds good, to awesome, I love this.
Well, and you know what? I really like that. Go back to that one there, Dustin,
Okay.
that you were just showing, because only a quarter of the people seemed kind of excited. And even then, what does finally mean? Maybe they're just like, get on with it. We knew this series was going somewhere. I don't know. But I'm glad. I don't want this to be something people are really jazzed about because it is not that important.
Yeah.
You could have made a different decision and that would have been okay too. So I think that graph shows some good shepherding. You win 83 pastor points. Good for you. Which one are you
Okay.
going to show us next?
Just how well they like the primary translation being CSB. And 22% said they're ecstatic about it. 67% said, I really like it. And then somebody said, I'm okay with it. So
Okay.
well received there. This was when it was kind of interesting to me. I wasn't sure what to expect on this one. How has my switching to the CSB influenced you to use or not use the CSB? And I was particularly struck by one responder who is in his 70s, who said that now the CSB is actually his primary translation.
Yeah.
He
Wow.
was converted in his 30s or 40s, I think, and he'd been using the NASB for decades. But when I started to talk about the CSB, he thought, hey, this is great. I like this a lot. So you'll see the reactions here. They vary pretty widely, but they're all in the various positive
Yeah.
format. I read from it more in my personal time. That's 44%. And then 5% is, 22.2% is the CSB as my personal translation of choice.
So nobody gave that answer number 2. I'm more confused now.
No.
Great. Excellent. Good pastoring.
To what extent do you recommend the CSB to others? 67% of people said the translation of the CSB is among the top 2 that I recommend to others.
That's good. And you have some confidence behind it. That's good.
Yeah. So I think that's all the... Oh, this is an interesting one. What translation do you tend to bring
very
and use
interesting.
to your worship services? And notice there's a duplicate answer here. I have CSB of my own as the blue. You'll see there 55.6%. But then there's also the, if I can go to a red right there, which is 11.1%. So in other words, 2/3 of the people bring CSB. Now, I should have asked how many used to bring CSB, but they didn't. They didn't before, but now
right.
they do. But I didn't
But
think to ask
presumably some people changed because not
apparently.
everybody was using the CSB beforehand. Yeah, that's really
that.
great.
This
Dustin,
person
I'm
says, I bring a
thrilled about
CSB, but I cross-reference others. This person says, I switch it up so that I don't have a normal. but I think the CSB is the most common. I was also very surprised by how many people really enjoy the Pew Bibles. My wife being one of them, because she's wrangling two boys,
I get that.
and I'm not able to be there in the pews to help her do so, because I'm up there preaching. And so no negative feedback. Some said it's okay. Some people said, yeah, that's really helpful. And then more than half the people who responded were like, these are really helpful to us. So that's the survey. I let there be an option for people to give advice for other churches, pastors seeking to switch their translations, and you can read the answers on the screen there.
And some people recognize that this could have been controversial elsewhere, but you didn't have any King James only brothers or sisters in there, and so
thankfully,
nobody was, and no ESV only or NASB only either. And you're right, that's not a formal position, but it just seems to exist. And I especially hear it because of the sometimes mean comments they'll make, especially about functional translations.
Yeah.
And you're just thinking, have you ever read it? Did you not have the experience of understanding some verses that you didn't understand before? I mean, can you at least be grateful for that? That's really good. Now, I'm really, really pleased by this, Dustin. You and I already talked through this stuff as it was happening, but now that some time has passed and it's settled, I'm just even more joyful over this, that you could make this transition, guide the sheep carefully and knowledgeably. Those responses indicate to me that you brought them along. You didn't yank them. They were taught. And I remember when my church, my pastor Mark Minnick, went through a similar long series on Bible translation, on bibliology in general. And I myself was just like, get on with it. Let's make the switch. But I saw that patience was really important, because in our circumstance, in a much larger church, in a different setting, in a different time, 20 plus years ago, there were some folks who were influenced by King James onlyism. And I'll never forget, I've told the story in the channel before, I think. I was sitting behind a deacon, older man, nice man. I had done yard work with him. I was like an 18-year-old church member, and we had worked on the church grounds together. And after we took the vote in our church at that point, before the ESV and CSB even came out, we voted to allow liberty to use other translations that were, solid, and the service wasn't over. But after the vote, before the service was over, this older man got up and left. And I saw his face, and I realized he'll never be back. And I realized that's why my pastor spent so many weeks on this, because some sheep, understandably, are confused. So praise the Lord for those responses.
Well,
and I appreciate your wisdom.
Not everything that I did can be emulated by another pastor. For instance, any other pastor is going to accidentally switch translations to something else. Probably not. But they can hopefully imitate the speed, the slowness at which I went, the fact that I tried to make it uncontroversial by saying there is a number of good translations, and shepherding people, answering their questions, being willing to meet with them if they had any questions. And then a lot of that had already been paved for me by the previous pastors who had done such a good job at using the plethora of versions we have.
Yeah, one of the big reasons I wanted to talk to you as well, beyond what we're just talking about here, what I think it's good shepherding, and I hold it up as a model for any of the pastors out there who watch my channel who are interested in, how can I do this? What should I do? Is that you chose the CSB, and that is uncommon among my friends. And I'm not judging that as negatively. That's just a fact. It's uncommon among my friends. But I think one of the big things that comes out of this conversation, for anybody who's wondering, what do I do, is I can't remember what label you use, but it just doesn't have it has a good reputation, but it kind of doesn't have a big reputation, it seems to me.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah.
So it doesn't have baggage. That's something else you said. I feel like the ESV is attached to the Reformed tribe, and the CSB, the King James is the King James only tribe, and the NIV is broader evangelicalism, and CSB just kind of is.
The CSB does have a little bit of Southern Baptist
that's where it comes from.
to it, but if you look at the people who were in charge of this and helped edit it, yes, you had two big name Southern Baptists. You have Tom Schreiner and David Allen that were the two co-editors on the translation. But there's a a whole bunch of other people from other denominations. I think there's like 100
Right.
different denominations or something on there. It's not a Southern Baptist Bible. It's
Right.
hopefully becoming just a good translation in the conservative evangelical sphere.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And the ESV has not been able to shed its, those criticisms that it's the Reformed, it's the Calvinist Bible. It hasn't been able to shake those.
Yeah.
Like the CSB, whenever I hear, and I don't hear that often, well, the CSB is the Southern Baptist Bible. For whatever reason, just taking the climate of opinion, that criticism has been like water off of a duck's back. It hasn't stuck to the CSB because I don't ever see people pointing to a particular rendering and saying, see, this is where they changed the Bible. I just don't think
Yeah,
that's the case.
exactly.
Now I don't think the criticisms of the ESV are fair. But I can understand why Genesis 3:16 in particular. That's the one that kind of gets brought up often. I can see
Yeah.
why people would say that, even if
Sure.
I think that the rendering is defensible. Well, Dustin, thank you so much for your time. I think there's a lot of wisdom that you've just provided for us, and I think that you're ready and willing to provide even more wisdom. Tell us how pastors, especially out there, can get hold of some of the resources you put together.
Sure. All of the videos that I did were recorded on YouTube from this Sunday school class, except for 2 interviews. One was with you, and one was with a linguist, translator, official with Wycliffe Translators. Except for those 2, all the rest have been recorded on our YouTube channel in a playlist. So people are welcome to look at that YouTube playlist, watch them if they like. Or if you want the typed out notes that I used, I have all 15 lessons available, and I can email them to you. You can find me on our website, mercybaptist.net, and if you fill out the contact form there, I'll get the email, and I'd be glad to send you those notes in PDF form.
Great, Dustin. Maybe could I ask you, Dustin, the favor to try to be aware for the first week or 2 of the comments on this YouTube video after it comes out, and maybe you can interact with people there too. Thank you so much. That's really generous of you, not only to give this time, but to offer those resources. May the Lord bless you, brother. Good to chat with you.
Thanks, Mark. You're a great friend.